Hello everyone, it's Wednesday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. After China's foreign minister recently made a rare visit to Washington, the White House confirmed that U.S. President Joe Biden and Chinese leader Xi Jinping are to meet on the sidelines of the APEC summit in San Francisco. If the summit does take place, it will be the first one since a meeting in Bali last November. But what would be discussed during the summit? And if the U.S. and China get to reboot their ties, how does this affect tensions on the peninsula? For this, we have invited Doctor Go Myong-hyun, a senior fellow from the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Dr. Go, welcome.
It's nice to be here.
Thank you for being with us. And we also have Shreyas Reddy, correspondent at NK News Seoul. Good to have you with us, Shreyas.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Now, first question to our Dr. Go. So before we tap into the promise of a Biden-Xi summit, I'd like to ask you for some background information. The leaders met at a G20 summit last year in November. What was discussed there and how have the bilateral ties have been up until now?
So the last summit in Bali, last year's Xi Biden summit in Bali was more of an occasion for United States and China to set essentially a floor to the intensifying friction between the two major powers. Remember last year, there's a very intense pressure on the part of the United States, especially with the economic security measures targeting China's semiconductor industry. In October last year, United States passed a very stringent measures to limit the transfer of technology and then skilled personnel that could facilitate China's achievement in achieving high level of semiconductor production, and then there are other measures such as like a freedom of navigation operations in Taiwan Strait that put pressure on China militarily as well. So there was this concern that the two major powers, they were essentially there's a risk that these two major powers might actually clashing with each other, within near future. So the summit in Bali serves as an occasion for the two countries to tone down the friction and as well as set some guidelines on how they would manage the potential conflicts that could emerge in the meantime. And then one of the major communication that emerged from that was that essentially the both sides agreed to disagree on some major points such as the Taiwan issue as well as the technological competition, but at the same time they agreed that they would work together in lowering the tension in the Korean Peninsula as well as cooperating with each other when it comes to limiting the downside effect of climate change. So in that sense, it's a very constructive event, because at the moment there's this concern that the major powers, they were essentially on a clash course. But then things have improved since quite a bit since then. So there's been a change in discourse on the part of the West, not just the United States, but the European countries. They try to change their narrative about China. So overall, there's a more cautious optimism about the prospect of improving the bilateral relations between the United States and China.
All right, I see. Well, Shreyas, after months of diplomatic maneuvering to improve ties, Washington and Beijing finally agreed that they're going to have a summit in San Francisco this month. Against what backdrop do you believe the two leaders agreed to have this summit?
Well, I think, of course, as Dr. Go pointed out, these are the two major powers in the world at the moment, and certainly for the last few years, they have been competing or they've had a rivalry of sorts as they compete for influence across the world. And in the years since that Bali summit, there have been other ups and downs as well. Earlier this year, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken canceled a planned China visit after alleged Chinese spy balloons were spotted over the U.S. mainland. Since then, things have normalized a little more. Blinken visited China. Other Chinese and U.S. officials have made visits to the other countries and to the other side in the meantime. And on the whole, at the moment, the rivalry still does exist. There will still be differences and major disagreements on a lot of aspects as the two countries side take different sides on different issues, including Taiwan is a persistent issue, Russia, Ukraine, North Korea, of course. But as Dr. Go said, there is a chance now for further dialogue, further diplomacy, and for them to find common ground on various topics.
Right, I see your point. Now, Dr. Go, I'd like to tap on several agendas that could be discussed, and among them will almost certainly be export controls, as both countries tighten their export controls on either technology or crucial raw materials. Do you believe the economic tension would be able to be thawed?
So I think, well, we are cautiously optimistic that will be the case, especially because Korea benefits from stable economic relations between China and the United States. But at the same time, on a more pessimistic note, I think the United States is very much consistent when it comes to applying a pressure on China and also as imposing an upper bound to how much China can develop its key emerging technological sectors, especially concerning the semiconductors as well as the artificial intelligence. So I think the export control measures that we have seen since last year, since October last year especially, will remain in place. But what's going to change is the tone of the discourse about China. I think the Chinese have been very I would say, concern about the radicalization of the American discourse about China's role in the world. So that was the motivation behind the so-called decoupling from China. But at the same time, it would be impossible to decouple from such a major economic powerhouse such as China. So that's the reason why, since the G7 meeting in Hiroshima earlier this year, the West, so to speak, the European countries and the United States, as well as Korea and Japan, and Australia and New Zealand, this country shift the focus of the China policy from decoupling to de-risking. So what it means is, instead of focusing on China as an entity, all other countries that trade with China would focus more about having a more of a stable supply chain, diversifying their source of critical materials such as critical minerals and high-tech components, and then at the same time, essentially, through diversification, stabilize any kind of political risk that could emerge between China and the United States. So in that sense, the focus is no longer about China or trying to paint China as a threat. It's more about the system itself. So I think this is something that China finds constructive, and I think this is going to be repeated over and over again as an achievement in the upcoming APEC summit meeting between the two leaders. But having said that, I think there are a lot of outstanding issues that the two major powers could work very closely together. There's North Korea, obviously, but it's kind of fading into the background. But there's the issue of Ukraine and more fresh source of conflict, which is the Middle East. So I think China has a role now in the Middle East, and I think the United States would like to see China to have a more of a constructive role there too.
Right. Dr. Go, since you have already mentioned about the war in the Middle East region, the U.S. could urge Beijing to play a more conciliatory role because of its strong ties with Arab states. How does each country's view of the matter differ, and do you believe China will be able to take this role as a mediator?
So China is a new player in the Middle East. Historically, the Middle Eastern countries, except for Iran, maintain very strong ties to the United States. But China has emerged as a new player because essentially it's the biggest consumer of the Middle Eastern products, which is petroleum. So that has given China leverage with the major oil exporters in the region. But then when it comes to the understanding or depth of a relationship, it's not really about China and the Arab states, but then more about China and Iran, which is not an Arab state, it's a Persian state. But then Iran is essentially a spoiler right now in the ongoing conflict between Israel and Palestine. Iran maintains very strong ties, not just with Hamas, but also with Hezbollah. So I think this could be a reason why the United States is reaching out to China, because the United States has already very strong communication channels with the Arab states, especially in the Gulf area, but then doesn't have that level of communication or dialogue with Iran. So China can step in, and then there's an incentive on both sides to manage the situation in the Middle East, because no one wants the major regional conflict breaking out or escalation at this moment. So I think that's the reason why we are cautiously optimistic that there could be some possible contribution from China for the stabilization of the situation in the Middle East.
Right, so China could step in the region.
Exactly.
All right, I see. Well, Shreyas, issues related to North Korea will also be on the list. And though China seemed to be quite distancing itself from strengthening ties between Russia and North Korea, some say Beijing, having forcibly repatriated hundreds of North Koreans back to the north from China, shows its willingness to cooperate with Pyongyang. What's your view on this?
Well, there are a couple of sides to this issue. One is, of course, the larger picture of China's relations with North Korea and Russia in an increasingly polarized world. There will be some issues where China will back them on the global stage. There will be some issues where it disagrees. But when it comes to the repatriation of North Korean defectors, this is actually very consistent with China's long-term policy. As far as China is concerned, North Korean defectors have in China, in Chinese territory, it has always viewed them as illegal migrants and has certainly in the past cooperated with North Korea to send them back. It's just that now we're seeing it in large numbers after almost 4 years of border closures in North Korea. So that is perhaps why it's getting so much attention, so much focus right now. But this has been the case for a while. Even the 2014 UN Commission of Inquiry report on North Korean human rights effectively said that China plays a big role in sending North Koreans back to China. It monitors them. They do not really have rights there. If it finds any, it often informs the North Korean authorities and helps and gives them a chance to recapture the defectors, and also makes it very hard for them to escape to other countries, something that has become increasingly difficult in the last few years between the pandemic and increasing surveillance. So it is a sad state of affairs in many ways, but essentially this is still consistent with how China has treated the North Korean defector issue for a long time.
Right, so China was just sticking to its long-term policy. Right, I see. Well, Dr. Go, before I wrap up this discussion over Biden-Xi summit, if the Biden-Xi summit serves as an opportunity to, improve their ties and reboot their ties, how does this affect the tension on the Korean Peninsula?
Well, it's overall going to be positive, but then whether it's going to have a significant impact in the prospect of improving inter-Korean relations, I have my doubts about it. North Korea has been doubling down its investment or betting on perfecting its nuclear capability. North Korea has a very clear roadmap for becoming a nuclear armed state. It wants to achieve a massive production of nuclear weapons, and this can be done with or without tension between United States and China. So I think this is a goal that the North Koreans are clinging on to. So I don't think it's going to change their minds. But at the same time, it could have an impact on the trend of provocation on the part of North Korea. There's this concern that North Korea could carry out a seventh nuclear test, and that could be a major red line, not just for the United States, South Korea, and Japan, but also for China. And North Korea knows that. So North Korea might think that if China and the United States get too close, and then they think it's a risk because China might enforce sanctions more strictly, then North Korea might be a spoiler again by carrying out a test or provocation that irritates not just Washington, but also Beijing. And another wild card here is Russia. Russia is very committed to being anti-American and anti-Western as long as the war in Ukraine continues. And then they might think it's probably a good idea to broaden the front from Europe to Asia to distract the United States away from Ukraine. So there are all these factors that are working independent of relationship between China and the United States. So that putting all this together, the picture is definitely mixed about whether the improved bilateral relations between the United States and China could lead to stabilization in the Korean Peninsula.
Right, I see. Well, Dr. Go, that makes me wonder. So we have been talking about impact on the peninsula, but how about if the North Korea strengthens ties with Russia much more? I mean, I've just seen an article that it could provide more weapons to Russia. In that case, how China's position change?
So China, I think it's trying to find this perfect spot, so to speak, between having Russia and North Korea distracting the United States away from itself and perhaps the Middle East, and also weakening the U.S. presence in Asia. But at the same time, it doesn't want this newly found tightening of relationship between Moscow and Pyongyang to get out of control. For instance, maybe Russia giving too much confidence to Kim Jong-un to carry out a very severe and serious provocation against U.S. allies or the United States itself. So China has to manage this relationship between Moscow and Pyongyang. But I think so far it's within the manageable zone for China. So I think China is probably secretly pleased that the North Koreans and the Russians are doing a job that China doesn't dare to, because being watched too closely by the United States and its allies. But then if the heat gets too hot, then I think then that's when China is going to step in and receive the prestige and the attention as the mediator or broker and for stability in the region. So I think China is confident that they can manage the situation here.
All right, I see your point. Well, shifting gears a little bit here, Shreyas, last Tuesday, if I'm correct, a group of 4 individuals from North Korea arrived to South Korea through an eastern port city called Sokcho and expressed their intent to defect. And as far as I know, this was the first time since November 2019 when a group of North Koreans came to South Korea on a vessel through the East Sea. Is this a rare case?
Well, such defections across the sea aren't unheard of, but also they're not particularly common, I think. But at the same time, it is, of course, the crossing by water presents fewer clear obstacles than, let's say, running across the DMZ. So in terms of Korea to Korea defections, this is an avenue that has existed for a while. But there aren't, the cases are few and far between. For example, you mentioned, of course, 2019 was the last time they came across from the eastern side. On the other hand, but earlier this year, I think it was in May, some defectors also came across from the western coastal border. So effectively, there are these kinds of cases do happen from time to time, but on the whole, they tend to be rare. Most defectors tend to cross over into China from North Korea and from there make their way to other countries, usually through Southeast Asia, before ending up in South Korea, despite, of course, the risk of repatriation by China that we discussed earlier.
Right. Well, Dr. Go, this incident raised concerns over possible lapses in the South Korean military's maritime surveillance, as it could not initially detect the boat crossing over the northern limit line. Is this concerning?
So I wouldn't be too concerned. The reason is because we're talking about a very small wooden boat, and it has all the characteristics and properties of a low detectability or stealthy object. So essentially the maritime surveillance consists of either radars or visual monitoring, and depending on the weather conditions, it may be easy or not difficult to detect this kind of incursion by a wooden boat has stealthy characteristics. Or same with the radar, if there's a high waves, it's really difficult to detect such a low profile object in the rough seas. So in that sense, I think it's not like there's been lapses on the part of the Korean military. It's more about it demonstrated the limitation to the current technology to survey or monitor maritime borders. But at the same time, the implication is only become serious if the North Korean military might think that this is a potential way to send their agents or operatives to the south without being detected. But then if you put in the North Korean shoes, this method of sending valuable, highly trained agents or wooden boats in the rough seas is very dangerous. So, yeah, and then we know that there are instances where the Korean military was successful in detecting this kind of wooden boats before. So if we think that we estimate the chance of success to be 50%, I think it's a very low. I think that the North Korean military, despite their characteristic risk-taking patterns, will be hesitant to send their valuable assets to the south using this method. So I'm not too concerned about this.
Right, so we don't have to be worried about it too much.
Exactly.
All right. Well, it sure is. I'd like to delve a little bit deeper into the figures of defectors. According to the government data, 139 North Koreans defected to South Korea in the first 9 months of this year, and this is triple figure from a year earlier. Why is such an increase?
Well, I think the first thing, of course, is to allow for a little perspective on what we're comparing it to. So, for example, obviously this is a big change from last year and the year before that when, thanks to COVID, it became increasingly difficult for or nearly impossible even for defectors to cross over not only from North Korea to China, but from China to anywhere else, because China had had very strict border controls and surveillance of its own during the pandemic. So as China has eased borders since last year, it has at least given them a bigger and more of an opportunity to move across. But at the same time, it is hard to attribute it to any particular factor. Even the Unification Ministry, when it released the figures, said that there could be various factors that account for these. But one particular, or at least a combination of factors that may be involved in this is partly the fact that many of these defectors seemingly came from China, some of them even after spending many years, even over a decade. So the factors, partly that they had the opportunity to come across because of the eased border controls, but for many of the long-term ones, it was also a motivation, perhaps because of the threat of repatriation to North Korea, as they found that despite living there in China for a decade, their place might be in danger. Better to move on, even if they had a comfortable life there.
Shreyas, what was more interesting to me about this tally was that more women defect to South Korea than men. Is there any specific reason behind this?
Well, this has long been the case. Typically about 70% or three-quarters roughly of defectors tend to be women, and there has never been a clear consensus on why this is the case, but there are many theories. One is in terms of the roles men and women occupy in North Korean society. Men are often more embedded in the organizational structure, undergo long periods of military service, so it may be harder for them to actually escape, while women perhaps tend to be almost overlooked at times, so they end up a little more independent, a little more likely to take up their own path. And in one particular case situation is that particularly since the famine of the 90s, North Korean women have increasingly stepped up as the ones who manage their households, the breadwinners. Often they take part in North Korea's informal private market economy. And so many of them are also more aware of what life is like on the outside, or at least by North Korean standards, and they may find out, oh, we have an opportunity to head to China or some other country to earn more money, whether it's temporarily with the intention of coming back, or permanently, as in many cases. So that is a big factor. Some other theories suggest that they may simply be looking to escape the patriarchal and autocratic North Korean society, while others may have motivations such as getting their family, their children to safety.
All right, interesting. Well, Dr. Go, we are running out of time, but I'd like to ask you this last question. Ursula has already told us one of the reasons for this increase in the number of defectors, but the Unification Ministry pointed out the increase of this number shows the chronic food shortages that North Korea is going through right now. I mean, it's not surprising, but how serious do you believe it is?
So, I mean, the North Korea clearly suffers from the structural food deficits, and in that sense, it's a permanent situation. So it's not surprising that there are reports of a few food shortages taking place in some parts of the country. But then what's new here is that these defections, if indeed driven by a shortage in food production, it's taking place in autumn, late autumn, which is the harvest season in Korea. And the North Korean media had claimed that they enjoyed bumper harvest this year. So in that sense, we shouldn't be seeing this kind of defections taking place at this point with the year, and so that's the reason why I think the Unification Minister is pointing out that the food situation is more acute than we had estimated. So I think earlier next year, when it's clearly a time when there are food shortages, and I think we're going to see possibly more defections where people are really risking their lives to get to a safer place.
All right, I see. Well, unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Dr. Go, as always.
My pleasure.
And thank you, Shreyas, for your time and insights as well. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.